Afternoon, my name's Darryl Morris. I'm actually giving, this talk will be on self-sovereign identity systems, which needs to be the talk before the governance talk I'll be doing tomorrow. I'm an independent developer. I develop primarily on Solidity, so I write smart contracts. I'm self-funded, so I run my own projects. I've been working in this field for about 3 years now. And the market values of Ether have put me into quite a nice space where I can do my own thing, run my own projects along my own ideals and try and present the community something of value. What takes my interest is more the humanitarian end of the blockchain, the governance end of the blockchain. Blockchain in itself is a very broad spectrum. Right, we can see it can take from the high end of town, like the fintechs, the banks, they can put their stuff on there. The commercialists, the industrialists, they can put their stuff on there. What I'm looking for is some of the fundamental reasons blockchain exists is for the disenfranchised. That don't access banks, that don't access these economies. Right? All that comes back to what we call, or what's come to be called, self-sovereign identities. Right? So I'll start with a little story. In your Chandogya Upanishad, there's this story of Indra and Virochana. Indra being the king of the gods, Virochana at the time being the king of the demons. They go into Prajapati, who's the lord of all beings. And they say, and Prajapati asks, "Desiring what have you come to live here?" And they say, "We seek that self which is free from evil, free from old age, free from death, free from grief, free from hunger and thirst. He who has found this, he who understands that self, he obtains all worlds and desires." And Prajapati says, "That person which is seen in the eye, that is the self. That is the immortal, the fearless. Look at yourself in this pan of water. What do you see?" We see ourselves in every detail. Our clothes, our hair, even to the lines in our eyes and even the whorls on our fingers. Prajapati replies, "Thank you for your enrollment. Here is your Aadhaar number. It is free from evil, free from old age, free from death, free from grief, free from hunger and thirst. Understanding this self, you'll obtain all worlds and desires." What are you doing, India? You've got perhaps 10,000 years of a culture that's explored the true identity, that's taught the true identity, and taught that that true identity is not the body. Right? Now that body, your very bodies, are being leashed to a massive, centralized, man-in-the-middle surveillance and control system and considered your only identity. Leashes which can probabilistically or purposely fail to deliver services. Aadhaar authentication becomes a single point of failure and a potential choke point. It invalidates all your other identity documents by non-acceptance. It's sold as optional, but practically impossible to live without now. So exclusion is rife. And so it is currently being challenged in the Supreme Court as we speak. So it's being challenged by eminent advocates Shyam Devan, Kapil Sibal and Gopal Subramanian, who argue that the government seeks a cradle-to-grave branding on the whole population, that biometric enrolment and authentication failure leads to exclusion and expulsion, that UADAI, Aadhaar, and the state residential data hubs architecture is an unsecure surveillance network and therefore a national security risk, that the Constitution itself does not permit a surveillance state, that Aadhaar enables the new categories of Aadhaar-enabled fraud which are hard to prove and defend against, that fundamental freedoms such as privacy cannot be sold, yet Section 7 allows mandatory Aadhaar to be mandatory. The individuals must part with their biometrics and alternative identification in violation of freedom of privacy and right to an identity by alternative means. The individuals have no right to complain against a violation. That the state comes to dominate and make transparent the individual rather than the state being transparent and subservient to the individual. Designed so public and private corporations can access a 360-degree profile of you. Now, has anyone just been seeing in the news this whole Facebook Cambridge Analytics story, which has politicized your Facebook data, or 50 million Americans' Facebook's data, to empower Donald Trump to become president of the United States? Right. This is the power of private data aggregation, private data manipulation, and centralized identity abuse. So the two greatest sins of Aadhaar that I can, to my mind, are one, it makes presumptions upon the state of people's bodies on which it has no right to do. And the second is that enforces those presumptions to privilege those where the presumption is correct and excludes those where the presumption is not correct. It was put up as a way to feed the poor, and that is certainly not a wrong thing to try. All civilized nations need these aspirations to reduce corruption and look after their vulnerable. But using welfare and anti-corruption as arguments to steal fundamental human rights is in itself corrupt. Right? It cripples the dignity of the entire nation. So why is it so hard? Why can't we have these beautiful technological stacks? And Aadhaar is quite an amazing piece of technology. Like, I've gone through the documents of its architecture. Right? It's technologically very impressive. So why does it become so wrong? Look in the bowl of water, what do you see? We think there's only one identity. We think we have one body, therefore we have one identity. But that's not what our identities are. Our identities are built of a multitude of relationships. Right? My relationship now with each of you, and how many of you there are here in this room. So we have, just as in examples of relationships, or of identities, we have a personal, existential identity. This is what we realize in our own consciousness, who we are, what our capabilities are, who we are as a person, what our private thoughts and actions are. It's this identity, this privacy, which must be protected against all harassment and violence. It's your self-view arrived at by simple self-awareness. It's nobody else's business. Right? It's private within the mind, emotions and the body. Day-to-day awareness of different aspects of the self change. You wake up one morning, you've had some enlightening dream, and you think, I'm a new person today. It's not a singleton identity. We have a self-declared identity, who you say you are. I've told you my name's Darryl Morris. We can probably all agree on that, on pretty easy trust there. Maybe different on different days. I might tell someone I'm someone else tomorrow. It'll be different to different people. Right? My friend here, Daniel, we know each other quite well. I've only met you today. I'm not even sure, I haven't really met you yet. But it's taken by others on trust. It's not a singleton identity. We have a social identity, which is who others say we are. Daniel referred to Jay, my Twitter account. That's a social identity. Next thing, I look on my phone and I've got Jay following my Twitter. It's like, where did you get that? It's an identity that was referred. It's the collective impressions you receive from, and I don't know why it's doing that, and have upon society. But you're a different person to different people, and with different relationships. It's not a singleton identity. We have imposed identities. It's imposed on you by an authority. So a government will impose upon you an Aadhaar number on giving up your privacy. Different authorities impose different identities based on some presented fact or proof of some other identity. Right? I go and get my driver's license. That's an identity. I go and get my passport. That's an identity. Different authorities. They'll impose some by each of theirs. Not a singular identity. So identity is not singular. So let's stop trying to pretend that it is. Let's stop trying to build these systems where we rely on one single fact. And we need to treat identities as relationships outside of which no one else has any business. So what can we do? What kind of relationships can we systemically build or use? Right, so we can have transactional identities. So you have a relationship with your bank, you have a history of transactions on your accounts, and over time, you know, they'll trust you more and more, I guess. It's a growing record of transactions or an entity, of an entity or agent with other entities. It's your economic footprint, which could be used as evidence to attest to an identity. If you've got receipts, and everyone keeps all their receipts, don't they? You could present a whole list of receipts and prove that you're shopping at some particular shop. Many identities can be run in parallel by a single agent. So we have reputational identities. You know, Aadhaar has this, if you don't have any documentations, you have this, what do they call it, introducer mechanism, which perhaps 0.03% of Aadhaar holders have had to use, which is not a very big number. As an aside, I have a deep interest in particularly the poor in India, how they're surviving these things when they don't even know their birthday, where they're working in the stone quarries and they've rubbed their fingerprints off. Can they access healthcare? How did they fare demonetisation or decashing? They're not doing well at all. You know, so reputational identities, so it's what other people say about you. We can formalize that on the internet with likes and such things like that. So a reputational identity is identities built up by a history of third-party ratings. So can act as abstracts of transactional identities. We can have attested identities. So an attested identity is an identity that identity by accepted attestations of facts by third parties, such as an attendance record or certificate. Right. We can aggregate an identity from these proofs of different identity sources, different attestations. And this is kind of the model where blockchain is using. Attested identity networks can be built up as webs of trust. So if I trust this series of relationships, or this series of attestations, I can then follow those attestations, and that will give me trust in some other identity. We can evolve preferential attachments. I can evolve preferential attachments to trusted networks. So this comes into what they call Metcalfe's law, network effects, things like that. So if you have a web of trust of identities, that web itself becomes more and more trusted the more attachments you get to it. But if we're not treating identities as singletons, we leave ourselves open to what are called Sybil attacks. Now in computer science, or Sybil, I don't know the actual original story, but a Sybil attack is one agent presenting multiple identities to derive benefit multiple times from some provider. Right? And this is the big challenge to blockchain, because you can be anonymous, because you can have any number of keys. Right? If someone comes out to provide a limited service, what's stopping that one person coming in and just taking that service multiple of times? So they use a multiplicity of personas to extract benefits beyond a defined allocation for a single identity. So Sybil mitigation, rather than trying to stop her altogether, we can do it at a service level through social identity capital. That's what I was saying, like you can build up a civil capital within your identity structure, which you can then use as collateral. So if you want to take some service, then you have to have some measure of trust in your identities that you present. It's not really a problem for bills. No one wants to pay their bills twice, so you don't have to worry about that kind of economics. So the basic approach is to make Sybil attacks uneconomical or punishable. Right? On Ethereum proof of stake, they do this by what's called slashing. So if you have a validator that's moving, or that's validating blocks instead of using proof of work, we're using proof of stake, where you have to put up some amount of money, right? And if you're proven to be cheating, your amount of your stake is just slashed. It's gone, right? And then you have absolutely no power to influence the network thereafter until you provide another amount. So it's a very effective way to stop Sybil. Right, so when we're designing these systems that use a decentralized identity, we're looking at this notion of civil capital. Right, we build up trust in our identities, and we use that measure of trust to trade or to collateralize. So civil capital, it's the weight of trust and identity gains over its history of civil activities. It could be used for staking or collateral in a service delivery or exchange. So self-sovereign identities, you get privacy through self-created, de-individualized identities. So I have me, and then I have this decentralized, de-individualized layer of multiple identities. And it's through that that I interact with the world. Whereas my existential being, my privacy, is held below that. No one can really look through that layer of de-individualized identity. Again, it's a pseudonymous privacy. I mean, you can stitch it all together and you might be able to find me at my address, like my physical address and whatnot, and dox me on whatever else you want to do. But at least it's some level of protection, completely decentralized. Individuals, collectives, and digital agents can protect themselves by control over their personal, private information using a pluralistic, decentralized identity. These identities become a single source of truth to user-owned and updated personal data. Now, this single source of truth is what Aadhaar is trying to say that is such the great thing about their system. We're providing this huge big database where you trust the database, regardless of who it's actually pointing to and what their situation is. With this system of decentralized ID, you yourself become the central point of, the single point of truth. Right? It's your responsibility to keep your private data available, or your personal data available, and permissioned to those who need it, and only those who need it. So they can be pluralistic for different purposes. One to manage your finances, social relationships, one to manage your healthcare relationships and data, one for academic or employment records, and so on. So it's an identity through ownership of private keys, private cryptographic keys, which is the basic primitive of everything on blockchain. The key selection, how you want to create those keys. You know, a private key is just a random number. It can be anything. If you want to use a biometric just as the basis of your private key, that's fine, but that has to be your choice. Right? Aadhaar's not giving you that choice. It could be some brain wallet, some phrase that you can remember, so you know, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. If your computer's been destroyed or whatever, you can recover your private keys just because you know this phrase. Or it could be seeded, which is, again, just another list of random words. So they're portable and borderless. A tourist, a business person, or a refugee could still identify themselves no matter where they end up. They can act as locally authenticated single sign-on to blockchain and off-chain services. They can be used to permission owned encrypted data and control data sharing relationships. Personal data is locally accessible and locally authenticated from distributed encrypted network layers such as IPFS and Ethereum swarm protocols. And of course, you can send and receive money, financial and assets without, manage finances and assets without the need of intermediaries. And that's the whole point of blockchain. Let's get rid of the intermediaries, because if you can get rid of the intermediaries, you've reduced corruption by at least a third. So, on top of that, you've doubled your efficiency. So, as Indra and Vairocana go, Prajapati thinks, without perceiving, they've gone away, not knowing the self. Whoever follows such a doctrine will surely perish. Virachana declares that Aadhaar is the immortal self which must be served to enjoy life and grow. He grows rich and powerful until Bali, his son, hacks UADI, deletes Virachana's Aadhaar profile. Aadhaar no longer authenticates him, and he perishes. But before reaching the gods, Indra realizes that when the eyes grow cloudy and the fingerprints are worn, this Aadhaar will lead one to perish. He comes back to Prajapati and says, "Can you teach me about blockchain self-sovereignty instead?" He did return a third time and learned the true self. You can follow the Aadhaar Supreme Court arguments on Twitter. That's pretty much where I've been getting it. Some of the frameworks that have been put out there is UPortMe. That's one of the primary projects. And there is some standardizations as far as ERC 725, which is a self-sovereign identity standard for Ethereum, which is an API layer, and an associated one I haven't got up there, which is 735. And that's for the attestation kind of identities. Thank you.